So this is where kind of the deliberative democracy kind of movement kind of comes in, right? It's been going around for 30 years in a sense, some organization, but really the last 10, 15 years kind of exploded, both academically, like if you search for the term deliberation in journals, it's kind of shooting up, but also in terms of organizations that are involved in this, right? And there's lots of different terms of the word that's used with this. Coming from a lot of different directions, a lot of different disciplines. But this is kind of how I define the work and some kind of key components. And then the rest of the next 2 days are really kind of applying some of these. But it's an approach to politics being broadly kind of problem solving, right? I don't get too caught up on that word. And with citizens, not just experts and politicians. So like the Venn diagram, it's about bringing citizens, experts, and politicians together to kind of make decisions and address problems. Often working with facilitators or process experts, and we'll talk a lot about facilitation this afternoon. This kind of goes to that notion that right now we don't seem to have this, we don't think like this, right? Again, human nature wants things to be simple. Most of the way, we're really good at talking with people we agree with, really bad at talking to people we disagree with. So most of our processes, we assume you need a facilitator now to help you have a conversation. Right? But like I talked about, you can develop better habits. In some ways, the purpose of my organization is to make it self-irrelevant, right? That we build up such a culture of deliberation and collaboration in Fort Collins that they won't need my students anymore, right? I imagine I have some job security, so it'll take a while to kind of transform that in a way, right? But generally, working facilitators, one of the things we sent to y'all to print out is this NCDD resource guide. This is where we utilize a variety of deliberative techniques. This is just a really good resource of like a lot of different ways of doing this, right? Some of these are small group conversations, some of them are large group, some of them are online, most of them are face-to-face, some of them are 1 hour, one meeting for 2 hours, one it's a meeting for 2 hours every week for 6 weeks, some of them are all-day summit, some of the deliberative polling or kind of the heavy technology things is a 2-week process that people are paid for 2 weeks, like a citizen's jury in which someone kind of really commits. So there's all these kind of processes in some way, but they're all kind of the basic kind of theory behind them is very similar. Citizens come together, consider relevant facts and values. So it is about data and good information, but also about engaging values from multiple points of view. This is democratic. Right, so that's a heavy burden on me, is to make sure we get beyond just the usual suspects and beyond kind of the common assumptions in a way, and really think about different issues from different sides. And we'll talk more about those tensions as we go. Listen to one another. This seems typical, but most public process is not designed for anyone to listen. Right? Most public process is for people to speak, one at a time in the microphone. I don't know how often you go to a city council meeting or a public hearing. Right? But the people waiting in line aren't really listening to each other, right? Most city council and school board, the school board or the city council are not allowed to respond, right? They don't want back and forth because they don't want people to start yelling. There's some reasons for that, right? But if you have a controversial issue, you might have 100 people in line to talk about that issue. 100 people will speak, each for 3 minutes. The microphone turns yellow and then red and stops them from speaking, right? So it doesn't take all night. And then the city council can respond, right? So there's literally there's no interaction whatsoever, right? It's one at a time on the microphone. It's a collection of individual opinions. They call it a public hearing. No one's actually hearing, right? It's a public talking, right? That just kind of goes through, right? So our processes are designed for people to actually listen to each other. Listening is kind of a key democratic skill that's rarely talked about, right? Consider the underlying tensions, tough choices, and consequences, what I've been talking about all morning. Are willing to refine and adapt their opinions and interests, and this is a key theoretical point, right? Most of our processes are designed for people to express their opinion, right? Our process, democracy kind of requires people to refine their opinion, to improve their opinion. But we're also impartial. We're not designing the process to get them to think differently in a certain way, right? But we recognize that they typically come in with blinders on, seeing just one side of the issue, right? So if they actually have good background material, if it's a diverse group, and there's actual interactions and true, genuine conversation, they're going to change their mind, right? And that's kind of the point. And go back to the Founding Fathers and the Federalist Papers and things like that. Democracy kind of requires that. Requires us in conversation to improve our dealing with wicked problems and dealing with all these tensions requires interaction and conversation, right? And that's not what we're getting. Right? So our process is that we assume people are going to change their mind from when they walk in to when they leave. Right? And we assume that changing their minds because they're considering other perspectives, or negotiating that tension between what I want and what my community needs and what other people need, right? In that kind of constant process. And they're being exposed to hopefully better information. That information that's framed to help them think broadly about the issue versus information that's framed to support their opinion. Right? And then ultimately seek to come to a conclusion for action based on reasoned public judgment. This says, deliberation. The term deliberation means to weigh. It's based on decision making, right? There's a partner processes that's dialogue. Dialogue or processes just to create trust and understanding, but there's not a decision making component to it, right? But when I talk about public deliberation, which is the title of our centers, it's about deciding, right? What should we do? Sometimes the groups actually have some decision-making authority. Sometimes we're capturing that information to give to someone who has decision-making. We do a lot of work for the city, for the school board. And then sometimes it's more educational. We're just framing things in terms of a decision, even though we don't actually have the power for decision, right? That's kind of a long definition of deliberation that we're changing. This will get into a little bit more of what we're talking about with expert. Got a paper that just kind of playing with these ideas, but to really think about deliberation. One of the things I've pushed back lately, and maybe we'll open it up for a little feedback here. I don't talk nearly as much as the rest of it, so these first 2 hours. Install all the theory and see what you don't think. A lot of people might feel open-mindedness is seen as a virtue, right? And open-mindedness is generally a good word. People think open-mindedness is good, closed-mindedness is bad, right? Deliberation, we want to make better decisions, right? So there is an aspect of closed-mindedness to a better decision, right? Our process is, we need to start with open-mindedness, but at some point we need to close it. So I've been pushing back on my field of this glorification of open-mindedness, right? Because extreme open-mindedness is just as bad as extreme closed-mindedness, right? If everyone's ideas are perfectly equal, right, then we never make a decision. Right? And communities require us to make decisions. We need to discriminate between better decisions and worse decisions, right? So we're kind of pushing back on open-mindedness in some ways as an inherent virtue. And the issue, we want to find the right balance. We want our minds open in the exact right amount. Right? I mean, higher ed, in some ways, yes, we want open-mindedness, we want to expose diversity, we want to see lots of different ideas, but higher ed is also about developing knowledge and pursuing truth and those type of things, which has some closed-minded aspect to it, right? So there's a negotiation there in deliberation, and we'll see a little later on, process-wise, how we kind of shift from open-mindedness to closed-mindedness. And then the same thing is kind of with experts, right? We're trying to find that where experts aren't dominating too much, and everything is kind of driven by data in a sense, but also we want to get away from a lot of people that do my work are almost anti-expert, right? There's this assumption that we need to give the power back to the public, and the experts have too much power and those type of things, right? So I'm coming from an argumentation perspective where good data is critical, right? But I also see sometimes where data dominates too much because we want to focus again on what can be measured and what's kind of more empirical and those type of things, right? So within deliberation, we're kind of negotiating those two tensions between open-mindedness and closed-mindedness, and between kind of focusing too much on experts and too little on experts, right? And I imagine we might be different where we are on this, right? But again, we're in that same conversation, right? With different issues, what is the role of the expert on that? Right? So this is the map. I'll go through this a lot more tomorrow morning. But this is the theory, the cycle of deliberative inquiry, which is the work that we're doing, right? So when I pick an issue, when an issue kind of gets on my radar, the first thing I do is I do deliberative issue analysis, which is, again, looking at the underlying intentions, right? Looking at how all the different individuals, the one at a time at the microphone, the letters to the editor, how they talk about the issue, right? I'm both looking at the experts. What do the experts say? What do we actually know about what works and what doesn't work with this issue? But then what also the people are saying? What are the activists saying? Right? What are the values people are using? What are the stories people are using? Those kind of things, right? To start getting a sense of the issue, basically to create a map of an issue. I have all these voices, right? First thing I typically do when an issue jumps up to me is I'll try to find a good article like on CNN.com or some kind of popular website that has like 200 comments, right? Because then really quickly I can kind of get a sense of, okay, how are people talking about this, right? Again, individually those comments are horrible, but as a whole it gives me a sense of, okay, these are the things kind of people are talking about, right? So the deliberative issue analysis, I'm researching it and I get into a little bit more on some other pages in the workbook, but I make a distinction between scientific analysis. Scientific analysis is kind of looking at what is, right? What do we actually know kind of concretely, right? Strategic analysis is more, I've already got my position, let me go find evidence of it, right? And a lot of our work, actually, I think a lot of the assignments we give our students are this, right? Well, I teach public speaking, I teach argumentation, I teach persuasion. Most of the time we're telling students, it's like, make a decision and then go find evidence of it, right? It's very easy to do that with any issue, especially with the internet, right? No matter how bad your argument is, you can find some statistics that support it. You can find some good quotes that support it. What deliberative issue analysis is, instead of picking a position and seeking information from it, or just looking for kind of hard scientific information, we're asking the question, what should we do, right? And we're looking at options, so we're starting with a question versus a conclusion, right? So that's the issue analysis. Then convening is, how do we get the right people in the room? Probably the hardest part of our work, right? Because again, the loudest voices are going to show up inherently, right? With most issues, you'll have a bell curve, right? That people feel really strongly on one side, feel very strongly on the other side. Most people are going to be in the middle. Those people in the middle don't show up, right? So how do we get that? How do we get beyond the usual suspects? For me, I always kind of make the joke that in Fort Collins, in my community, if I don't do a good job of convening, of getting people out, I get white, older, progressive women. That's who shows up at my events, right? So if I want younger people, if I want men, if I want conservatives, and if I want white, older, progressive women, and if I want any kind of diversity in terms of ethnicity, I have to do my work, right? So convening is, how do you get the right people in the room to have this conversation, in a sense. And then facilitating is the actual events themselves, right? And I use the term interactive communication. That is somewhat redundant. Communication should inherently be interactive, but again, most of the time it's not with tough issues. Most of the time it's one way, right? Again, letters to the editor, or time with that microphone, or bumper stickers, or t-shirts, or whatever it is, right? So the actual interaction, real people talking to each other, is we have to kind of create that, right? And then from that is the reporting. Basically what we're doing with our meetings is we're creating new data that doesn't exist, right? It's very easy for me to find opinion on issues, but we take all those opinions, we make sense of the opinions, we create maps, we create discussion guides or backgrounders or something people to react to, and we put people in circles to kind of talk about it. We give them a facilitator and a specific process, and you'll see my facilitator is very active in the kind of questions they ask. So we're getting people to talk about those tensions. We're getting people to talk about kind of tough issues that they don't normally talk about. And at each meeting, we've got a note taker taking notes. We often use worksheets, so people are kind of answering questions written. We use the keypad, so we'll ask some questions in the front of the room to have quantitative data. So at the end of our meetings, we have all this data, which didn't exist before because people don't talk like this, right? And that helps us. So that kind of cycles back to the deliberate issue analysis, right? Okay, now what happens before everyone was. It's called paradox splitting, right? They're talking about freedom or they're talking about equality. So in the conversations, we pit them against each other. Let me give you a real life example. Helping the school district hire a new superintendent, right? So first they do a survey, and one of the questions on the survey, 2,000 parents answered the survey, what kind of characteristics do you want in a new superintendent, right? They give me all that data, right? This is a deliberative issue analysis, right? Literally almost half of the people said, we need a strong leader that makes the tough decisions. And half the people said, we need a collaborator that listens to all voices. Some form of those two, right? Both are good things, right? Would you rather have a strong leader or a weak leader? Strong leader, right? Would you rather have a collaborator or a terror, or someone who dominates? Well, you want a collaborator. But strong leader and collaborator doesn't fit together very well, right? A strong leader makes tough decisions, right? Collaborator talks and listens to everybody, right? So then we had a public meeting where we basically laid that tension out. We told people, half of y'all said this, half of y'all said that. That doesn't fit together, right? How do we negotiate that tension? What do y'all want? Right? So again, people were having a conversation they didn't have, right? Because the people that are saying strong leader weren't thinking, we want a strong leader, but I'm willing to give up this, right? And people that are saying, we want a strong collaborator wasn't saying, but I'm willing to give up this. They were just seeing the advantages of their perspective, right? So then by putting them together in conversation with each other, all of a sudden they're struggling with the tension, right? And what are we going to give up? Not just what values you want, but what are you willing to give up when there's an inherent tension, right? So the reporting is we get reaction of people to that tension that we didn't get in a survey, because in a survey I'm just giving an individual opinion. I don't have to kind of deal. Now there are some ways to ask survey questions that get at tensions. Right? I love even if questions. Are you willing to support this even if it means this? Right? All of a sudden people are struggling a little bit more on how to come up with that. Right? So the way the cycle is, we're trying to, hopefully each kind of path around the cycle, we've improved the conversation, right? We've created more understanding across perspectives. We've brought out some of those tensions and kind of negotiated them some. We've improved the quality of information, right? We've kind of undone bad information and negative assumptions, right? And we've improved kind of understanding of things. One real life example of that, again, working with the school district, dealing with small schools that were closing. Our funding model in Colorado is schools get funded per student, right? So some neighborhood schools that were kind of growing older, didn't have as much kids, had fewer kids, right? So they're kind of, should we close the school and kind of combine two schools? But for parents, the assumption was a small school means small class size, and everyone assumes small class size is a good thing. There's fewer students in the class, my student will get more attention, right? The problem is for a school, if they don't have enough students, they don't have enough funding, right? So one school might have, say 70 kindergartners, and they can divide it up into 4 classrooms because they can pay 4 teachers, right? A small school might only have 40 kindergartners, but they only have enough money for 1 teacher, right? So the large school has smaller class size than the small school, but parents didn't get that, right? So we ran 3 nights of forums about how do we deal with this tension. No one wants to close the school, right? But we need kind of economies of scale and those type of things. But the first night, my students told me afterwards, they remember me talking about that, saying, people at the tables kept on saying they liked the small class size. So at the next meeting, we started off and we explained that. We realized there's a public assumption out there that's wrong, that's making it hard for us to actually talk about this issue, right? So then we were able, the next meeting, to kind of clearly, talk through that and explain that before the forums. Right? Because with the process, we recognized misinformation that was dominating, and we could take it on. Right? And the fact that we were a trusted kind of community source, we could undo that misconception without being seen as, But the problem is each side kind of tries to undo their misconceptions of the other side. No one trusts anybody, right? So what happens when you have a trusted community member that, again, doesn't seem to have a dog in the fight, right? And we can kind of undo those misconceptions in ways that others can't. Right? Then we have action in the middle, right? And this has been an interesting kind of thing in a way, because we get criticized sometimes of just talking forever, right? So at some point you move to action. Now that action can be very complicated. In deliberative process, action is very broad, right? Action is individuals acting differently. Action might be nonprofits working differently. A lot of our processes have created new nonprofits. Right, so we have new 501c3 organizations that come out of our meetings, in a sense, because we realize we need a linchpin, right? We need someone that kind of focuses on that, right? So we have a new homelessness kind of organization got created by some of the stuff that we did, and a senior transportation coalition, and a partnership for age-friendly community. So that's kind of a form of action. And action sometimes might be policy change, right? So school district or the city government changes certain things, or new funding mechanisms, or we work a lot with our United Way. United Way has completely changed the way they do funding of grants, right? Partly tied to some of the work that we did with them in terms of poverty and needing to spark collaboration. Our United Way now, instead of individual grants and nonprofits working in the same area have to all come together and do one collaborative grant. So like every nonprofit doing early childhood education has to come together and as a group ask for money versus individually ask for money, right? Because they recognize the importance of collaboration, the importance of groups. And as part of that is they all have to agree on metrics, right? They all have to be measuring the kind of same thing so we get better data as a community of what works and doesn't work. Before, every single nonprofit measured their work in a completely different way, right? So action kind of works in a lot of different ways. But the reason I have this in a cycle versus a linear process is we're not going to come up with an action that solves the problem, right? We're going to come up with actions that hopefully help negotiate the tensions in the problem and then kind of hopefully improve the quality of life and improve the way we're dealing with those values. But the action just kind of changes the conversation in a way. Right? And so that's kind of the model we're going through. So what we're going to do tomorrow, I'll get a little bit more into this, and we have some exercises for each of these. But this workshop focuses primarily on here. Between issue analysis and the meeting, we have issue framing. How do you kind of frame the issue to kind of make a productive conversation? There's a lot of process design. What kind of questions you ask? What kind of activities can you have people do, again, other in the classroom and the community? So I have a lot of those materials here, but depending on kind of which of these 5 kind of steps, which are most interesting to you, right? We can kind of spend some time with each of them, or we can kind of dig deeper on a few of them. We'll dig deep on facilitating this afternoon for sure, but then we're open kind of what we want to do tomorrow. Right? That makes sense? The cycle?
Yeah.
Right. Trying to get through everything new. Right? All right, so a little bit about the broader deliberative democracy movement. I started creating this graphic at a conference. There's a university network for collaborative governance, probably about 8 years ago or so. And I was just fascinated with, I'm a communication professor, Wendy is as well. But at these deliberation conferences, there's people from all over the university, right? So I started kind of like looking around the room. Okay, they're from this discipline, they're from this discipline, and then just like most academics, every discipline has their own terms that they use for their own kind of literature. But it's interesting how deliberative democracy kind of is a nice home for all this of just ways of people connecting, right? I won't get into it now, but I've always been kind of a historian of higher ed. And it's interesting how, 150 years ago, higher ed was primarily kind of creating leaders and solving problems. But then kind of turn of the 20th century, we kind of followed the German model of higher ed's about producing new knowledge, right? And by producing new knowledge, it kind of compartmentalized, right? So everyone kind of got into their own subfield in a way. And then this deliberative democracy movement is kind of going back to that. We need all these pieces to solve problems, right? So I think a lot of academics, they get frustrated by the kind of the walls of their discipline in a way are really attracted to deliberative democracy. And I think one of the reasons communication is such a good, we've always been like that, right? Communication is always stole from everywhere, or borrowed from everywhere. So that's kind of the interdisciplinary. The first few times I showed this, I would get in trouble. Someone would walk up to me afterward and say, "I'm not on there," right? So I think it had like 8 slices. You see the slices get smaller and smaller. The font gets smaller. But hopefully I have most people on there now. But it's also extradisciplinary, which I'm pretty sure is a word I made up. But these are all organizations. These are community organizations that are out there, right? Both Winnie and I are very involved with the Kettering Foundation, which is one of these national organizations. Actually, they bring international people in all the time. It's a foundation that's basically, it's based on the question, what does it take for democracy to work as it should? And they're a convener. They bring people together to talk about it. It's interesting from an expert perspective. Kettering invented the automobile starter. So he's an inventor, invented a lot of different stuff, right? But he left all his money from all his inventions and his patents to start this foundation. Initially, it was a foundation to end world hunger. But after the first 5-10 years, I think, they recognized that hunger wasn't an expert issue, right? They knew how to end hunger. It was a political issue, right? They had to figure out how to talk to each other, how to work. It wasn't a technical kind of thing, right? So it shifted its focus from how do we end world hunger to how do we improve democracy, right? Recognizing that's kind of the issue that you need to focus on, right? So here are just kind of this is the National Issues Forum Network, which is tied to Kettering. NIF is kind of one of the base models of this work that we'll be kind of playing with in particular. I like to pull this up again just to kind of show you the interdisciplinary nature. This is pretty old, but so some of them are in cooperative extension, which is kind of almost agriculture in some ways. Here's a community college. This one is in a This one's in the honors program. Here's another community college. This one's actually a communication program. This one's in community and leadership development. This one's in the Office of Equity and Diversity. So these different centers, both Wendy and I's center is kind of based somewhat in communication studies, but it's all over the university of working on this. I'm going to flip through these again. I do this to kind of show it's not just a couple of crazy professors doing this stuff. There's actually out there people doing this work, right? So NCDD is just a wonderful website. You have the NCDD engagement. It's the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. Public Agenda, there's the Kettering Foundation. Everyday Democracy, America Speaks. The UNDP, the United Nations Development Project, has this huge democratic dialogue program, particularly in South America, but also kind of in Africa and other places. But it's kind of the same notion. Instead of sending experts in to solve a problem, you send facilitators in to kind of help people really talk through and do these type of things, right? And create a different type of capacity in the community. It's a really cool website. They have a 300-page handbook that you can just download offline of just tools of helping people have tough conversations. Public Conversations Project, we're Uniting America, the American Democracy Project, the Democracy Commitment, Democracy Imperative, University Network Collaborative Governance, right? All these kind of organizations, most of these have been created in the last 10 years, right?
Yeah. I think they're going to want, can we get these?
Yeah, I can give you the full, you don't have that on there, but I can give you the full, and that's one of the reasons the resource guide probably has all these listed in here, right?
In particular, the one with the handbook that you can download?
Yeah. It's if you Google UNDP Democratic Dialogue, then you'll get to it. But yeah, I'll send you my full PowerPoint if you want that. Has all the different slides.
Great, thank you.
I'll show you the paperwork.
Yeah, of course.
Right. All right, got 15 minutes. So I did have extras of stuff. This is a really short article I wrote. I think we got enough of those so we'll go around. That covers this. basically, I have a paragraph on each of these things, right? Now I know I've been talking for a long time, and now I just put up a slide that has 15 points, right? I know that's scary. We've already talked about almost all of these, right? I developed these key aspects. It used to be 10, then it got to 12, and now I'm at 15. It's kind of like my elevator speech about deliberation, if it was a really tall building and a slow elevator. But there's kind of, again, some of the key concepts that we'll kind of go back to, right? So we've already been talking about tough choices and, dealing with tensions a lot. And in particular, balancing individual interests and the public good, like we talked about, is just a constant tension that we need quality conversation to deal with, right? Skip this stuff now. Public judgment is, the heart. This goes back to my rhetorical background in a sense, but in some ways, universities used to be more about developing good judgment and wisdom, and then they shifted to focus more on developing knowledge, right? But knowledge is a means to an end, right? We need knowledge to make better decisions. And most of the tough issues we're dealing with, we're not going to knowledge our way there, right? At some point, we may need to make tough decisions between things. We're always going to have uncertainty. We're always going to have incomplete information, right? So that's the public judgment thing. So this is kind of a graphic we'll keep on playing with that I found a few years ago. This is Sam Kander's Facilitator Guide, really useful book if you're interested in facilitation. But he talks about with any kind of tough decision, we need to kind of go through at least 3 stages, right? So the first stage is we need divergent thinking. Here, we need open-mindedness, right? At the beginning of a process, we tend to be too closed-minded, right? We tend to have it already figured out, right? So most decisions, what happens is we don't have enough divergent opinion, we jump to a decision point, so we have false consensus. We think we all agree because we didn't let anyone disagree in the room. Or we didn't let them speak if they're in the room. Or if they spoke, we kind of shut them down pretty quickly, right? You've all been in a committee meeting, right? Where everyone seems to agree, but then someone kind of says, well, yeah, but, everyone, oh, all right, because now the meeting's longer, right? So there's a lot of kind of inherent kind of pushback against dissent, against, complicating things, right? So one thing, better process, we need better processes to allow for divergent opinion, right? To help people think outside of the box. To work harder at convening to get people that disagree in the room, right? So to avoid false consensus, we need kind of, how do we get more voices in the room, how to do that? We can do that in lots of ways. We can do that with surveys. We can do that individual opinion. We can do that if we search for it, right? If I'm an activist that wants people to follow my perspective, I want a very narrow range of opinions, right? I just want the people that agree with me talking, right? If I'm a deliberative practitioner that wants to consider all opinions and I care about democracy, I'm going to broaden the conversation. The problem is success kind of leads to problems here. If we do a really good job of divergent thinking, now we have lots of voices in the room, and it's messy, right? And so I think the problem we run into a lot more is we allow lots of different voices, and then we jump to a decision, right? So city council is dealing with a tough issue, they have public comment, we have 100 people at the microphone, they all speak their truth, right? And then city council makes the decision, right? And we allowed everyone to speak, no one was listening, no one worked through the issue, no one understood each other, right? So if I went to city council to tell them how horrible this idea is, and I got to speak my truth, and then 20 minutes later they vote for the idea, I'm thinking, what the heck? Didn't they hear me about how bad it is? Right? The city council is trying to balance kind of all these things in a way, right? So I think we have such a free speech tradition, especially in the United States, that there's lots. We have some work to do, right? Certainly the dominant voices, and but the problem isn't so much getting chances to speak. The problem is making sense of all that noise, right? And too often we have all the voices and then we jump to the decision, and that creates this polarization and frustration, right? So the middle part of working through the groan zone, and I love when I'm training facilitators about having that term, the groan zone, right? Because I can tell them that if your table is struggling, it means it's working, right? Because they should struggle. These are tough issues, right? And when people take the blinders off and they get away from the simplistic framing and they're now dealing with underlying tensions, it's going to be hard for them, right? But in the groan zone in particular, while there's lots of ways of doing divergent thinking, there's lots of ways of collecting opinion, right? The groan zone, for me, takes small groups, right? We need to have a real conversation. We need to be in a circle and talk about it, right? That takes interaction. That takes real kind of human, genuine communication. The problem is communities don't have that capacity, right? We have so much capacity, so many ways to give people a chance to speak their truth, right? We have very few ways for people to actually have a real conversation with other people and work through that, right? So that's the work that the CBD is doing, the work that we can be doing in our classrooms, is start giving students the skills to do that in a way, right? But then the back end, the next problem that happens, so if we get past false consensus, we get past false polarization, right? Then we get stuck with paralysis by analysis. Goes back to a simplistic good versus evil framing. It's easy to move to action. Let's just get rid of the evil, right? Once it's more complicated, once you realize people that you disagree with are coming from good, probably not as good as your place, but coming from a good place, right? It's harder to make a decision, right? You've complicated things, you get stuck there, right? A lot of our deliberative processes, we really change the conversation. People realize, yes, this is, got to see this from multiple angles, but then how do you move that decision? Or the same thing, so many people in our field glorify open-mindedness so much, which is great for divergent thinking, which is great for creating understanding and kind of talking about this, but then if we actually need to make a decision, right, then it gets harder, right? And there's so much focus now from the dialogue people of saying, one thing I specifically pushed back on, we did this activity at the NCDD conference, and one of the cards that we had about dialogue and deliberation was that, deliberation is all about the recognition that everyone's opinion is equally valid. I can't go there, right? I can go that everyone's opinion has validity, everyone's opinion has value. We should listen to everybody, right? But clearly some people's opinions are better than others. It's based on more experience and more data or a better mix of evidence. The simple thing is, we do some work on immigration issues, those type of things. I'm not going to seek out white supremacists to make sure they're in the room, right? I feel pretty comfortable that the white supremacist opinion is less valid than others, right? I'm going to draw that line somewhere in a way, right? So for convergent thinking, to make a decision, we need to start prioritizing. Some values are going to be more important than others for the community, right? So it's not that closed-mindedness is bad, right? It's arbitrary closed-mindedness is bad, right? We need to figure out better ways of making decisions and struggle with that. But there's not a set, expert way to make this decision of what's more important between these values. It's always going to be a constant struggle, right? So this becomes process-wise, what our communities, what our organizations need. We need better processes for divergent thinking. How do we make sure we get lots of voices in the room, right? We need devil's advocates and those type of things, right? And then how do we need better processes for working through the grown zone, right? As a term, kind of, how do we work through these issues and really kind of develop understanding and mutual respect but then at the end, we also need better decision-making process. What I don't like about this graphic is that the convergent thinking comes to a single point, right? A lot of people that do this work focus on consensus. Consensus is a very scary word for me, right? I rarely go for consensus in my process, because if you're dealing for a wicked problem, you're not looking for consensus, right? So the decision point can look in very different ways, right? Because some actors might do this, and some actors might do this, or at some points you might have to vote, right? Maybe it is majority wins in some senses, right? But if you've done a good process, there's a legitimacy to it, right? There's a good example to think about. Right now, most of our democratic processes, push it through, 51% you win, right? But you've won, maybe you pass that law, say Obamacare, right? But if 49% of the people are dedicated to making that work, right? If they believe the process was not legitimate, right? Their voices weren't heard, and the people who won because of manipulation or whatever, right? Then they're going to do everything they can to overturn that as soon as possible. In Colorado, we've passed marijuana, then undone marijuana, and then passed all this kind of stuff. Because after every election, whoever loses dedicates themselves to changing the law as soon as possible, right? That's because the processes are not seen as legitimate. We did a process with a school district about grade configuration. I won't get into the details, right? But it was a split vote, right? Very, very, both sides were kind of very strong. One of the school board members was completely against the change, right? They voted, I think it was 4-3 or 5-2 for the change. He was the first one to speak. And he said, I don't think this was a good idea, but now that we've passed it, my job is to work as hard as I can to make sure it works. It was so refreshing. It was so fascinating. Then I thought about it. It should be that way, right? We've gone through a process. We've seen the different sides, and then we've made a decision. Then everyone should say, "Okay, now let's make this work," right? But it was amazing to me how rare that was, right? That the losing side said, "Okay, I don't think that's right. Okay, let's do it. Let's figure it out," right? I mean, what would have happened if after we passed Obamacare, all Republicans said, "Ooh, I think that's a bad idea, but okay, let's figure it out. Let's just make this work." We have the perfect offer. And that happens on both sides of the aisle, right? When you have an adversarial thing, right? So a lot of this is how do we, if you do a good job of this and do a good job of this, then hopefully there's more legitimacy to this. that even the losing side says, ooh, I don't think that was right, but I see that I was heard, they respect my opinion, I heard them, so I know why they're doing that, and I can see that I think they made the wrong decision, but let's kind of try to make it work, right? And that's what we've lost in so much of our public policy. Right?